Hello everyone, welcome to this new video on Cosmopolis, the official channel of the Allen School of Liberal Arts. I'm Dr. Julien, I'm a faculty at the Department of Political Science and the director of the Allen Center for Eurasian Studies. And it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce a very special guest to you, a very prominent researcher and lecturer from the USA, Dr. Meghanne Barker, who is currently working in the Department of Education, Practice and Society at University College of London in the UK. Previously, she held the post of LSE Fellow in the Department of Media and Communication at London School of Economics and Political Science, and as a Harper Schmidt Fellow and Collegiate Assistant Professor in Social Science at the University of Chicago. Dr. Meghanne is a more than prospective scholar who received her PhD in Cultural Anthropology with a focus on linguistic anthropology from the University of Michigan in 2017. Her research examines the pedagogical value of creative practice, including children's play and performance, puppet theater, and filmmaking to post-socialist institutions of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Within the framework of her PhD, she has worked on the influence of animation movie on the development of Kazakhstani children, and now she's more specifically focusing on the role of media education to community building in the 21st century within the context of the former communist state of Yugoslavia. Dr. Meghanne, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. To break the ice, I would like to challenge you directly with a question that might sound a little provocative.
Oh no!
You come from the country of Hollywood and Netflix, and we all are too aware of, I would say, the extraordinary power of seduction of the American cultural industry, which has been deeply shaping the perception of the international audience for now more than one century. And it goes without saying that in mainstream US production, I would say that Russia, Soviet Union, or Yugoslavia do not tend to be depicted in a very positive way. So what made you leave the US to go to Eastern Europe and Central Asia? When did you get this passion for Eurasia?
I mean, I think the simplest answer in terms of what put a seed in my mind was that my grandmother, who just passed away this past year at 102 years of age, was born in Nebraska, but to Czech immigrants. And so she grew up speaking Czech in Nebraska for the first few years of her life. And so I think that gave me this kind of vague curiosity about Eastern Europe. And then when I was in university and I decided I wanted to study a Slavic language for reasons of convenience of my general schedule my last year at university, Serbo-Croatian, and that was what it was called when it was being taught at Columbia, was the one that fit into my schedule better than Russian was offered 5 days a week, and I didn't want to take a language class 5 days a week, so I chose that. And then as I found out more about the politics surrounding the language, as you know, that had been known as Serbo-Croatian under Yugoslavia and had fractured into different languages, then I was really curious about how that would be taught, and so that sort of got me curious enough to actually stay with it, whereas otherwise maybe I would have dropped it. And then that kind of sparked my interest in the region that kept going off in different directions the rest of my adult life. So
that's a very interesting and unusual story.
Yeah.
What is fascinating, I would say, in your young but already very rich career as an academic is the fact that you are not only a globetrotter who worked in very different countries, from the US to the UK and through Kazakhstan and Bosnia, but you are also a holistic professional, I would say, who likes exploring a broad range of areas within the field of humanities, from film studies to cultural anthropology, through linguistics, semiotics, pedagogics also. And I would like to ask you, how would you define the role and the importance of transversality, transdisciplinarity in your research?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it is sort of in part an accident of my personality that I'm very curious in different things, and I let that take me in different directions. And I think also, you know, I mean, one thing that's interesting about anthropology in general, but maybe particularly where I was trained at Michigan, it's a 4 fields program where we have to take courses in archaeology and biological anthropology and linguistic anthropology and cultural anthropology, no matter what our specialization is. So there is this kind of cultivation of a holistic approach wherever it is we're doing our field work. And then my advisor at Michigan, Elena Lemon, was doing field work with theater students at the time. And so she also was very open to cultivating this kind of curiosity. And so, for example, when I started doing my fieldwork in Kazakhstan, I had focused on, in all of my proposals and everything, on doing this work with children in some kind of an orphanage setting. And then at some point I wasn't sure if I was going to get access to such an institution, and I started to get interested in the puppet theater, and I saw that that was easier to get access, and yet something was still very compelling about these questions I had about children growing up away from their parents. And so at some points, you know, I kept going back to her to sort of ask, okay, do I need to make a choice between these two? And she's like, no, just keep following them both and you'll figure out how to put them together. And I think that, you know, it presents these challenges with publishing and with explaining yourself on the job market and things like that. But if you kind of stay true to yourself and your own curiosities, sometimes it can work out and at some point, and it seems like I've gotten lucky and it has, and so I've sort of have continued to do that, to sort of follow where things take me when I find something surprising and exciting happening.
Well, it is very interesting because it is exactly the state of mind that we try to cultivate in the Alliance School of Liberal Arts. We try to promote the idea of transdisciplinarity, that students can build their own career, following their own, I would say, inclination, and without only thinking what kind of professional we want to be, but what are their passions in life. And you are a perfect example to show us where curiosity can lead you in very different way. Actually, Dr. Meghanne, many of your works tend to have, even if you are very versatile, I would say, many of your work tend to have a common ground that lies in the complexity and diversity of childhood experiences. And more specifically, I would say, in the process of socialization and identity construction, whether this identity is being built with pictures, movies, puppets, or anything else. So I would like to ask you, what brought you to study the cultural background in which children establish social relations, and why is it such important to examine social bonds from different national perspectives to compare them?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think my interest in children and childhood was also somewhat accidental. When I was between undergraduate and graduate school, I was working in New York, and I wanted to get a job at a university so that I could take classes for free. And so I started applying to different jobs within different universities in New York, because most of these offered some kind of tuition benefits. And I had spent a lot of time over my entire life taking care of children as a babysitter. And I got a job at a Center for Toddler Development in the psychology department at Barnard College. And that really awakened me to the complexity of children between a year and a half and 3 years of age in terms of their development. I mean, it was interesting because it was within a psychology department, and so there were certain theoretical frames that they were using to look at childhood that weren't exactly what interested me the most. So at the same time, I started reading work from linguistic anthropologists on language socialization that were arguing for the importance of kind of decentering the Anglo-American middle-class assumptions about what development looked like. And so I was reading those and spending a lot of time with children at the same time. And at the same time, we were taking notes at the end of each session that we had with the children that for them, I think, were more akin to maybe notes that that maybe therapists take about their patients, or just sort of documenting their development, but in a very qualitative way, whereas I was thinking of those as being akin to field notes. And so I think that kind of cultivated within me a greater awareness of the kind of complexity and surprises that children have to offer. And then to go back to your earlier observation that in the US there tends to be, and I think particularly when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, you know, watching the Cold War, and there were all of these stereotypes about children in Eastern European orphanages and this kind of scandalous sort of awful conditions that they were found in. And when I was living in Sarajevo in my early 20s, I volunteered at an orphanage, and I found that actually the environment there was quite different. And so that made me very curious about in environments like that that I saw that were very different from the kind of stereotype. I mean, I think both types exist. There are the really awful ones, and then there are others that are where there are people who genuinely care for the children, and the children are getting some basic, their basic needs met, along with care and complicated relationships with their home families, but that they're sort of caring environments nonetheless. And so that kind of motivated me to take this curiosity about children's development, but see what it looks like in a sort of very different environment.
Oh, thank you very much. It's very interesting. You have such a broad range of experience related to children.
Moving all over the globe.
The reason why I wanted to ask you this question, it is that same as you know, I have spent some time in different countries, and I guess that you, same as me, you have probably noticed that human beings are not exactly the same everywhere on the planet, because given that their social, cultural, political, linguistic background is different, and environment always influence the development of people, especially during in childhood. Given that you have lived in Kazakhstan, in Bosnia, in the UK, in France, also in many places, I would like to ask you, because there is this trend in the US for a few years about French parenting, and I would like to ask you, where have you seen the happiest children actually, and the most fulfilled children? In what society?
The happiest child is my child.
That's a perfect answer.
About all of the other children in all of the other places, no comment. No, I mean, I don't have, I think that, despite, I mean, on the one hand, I guess I'll take a very anthropological approach and say, like, as a cultural relativist, I don't want to believe in some kind of a ranking of that there's a correct way to parent children, because as I've become more and more aware, but I think I was somewhat aware before, taking care of a child is always a complicated endeavor, and so I would never take it upon myself to say that one way is better than another.
So maybe I can reformulate my question in a different way.
Okay.
And do you think that your experience as a researcher with children from Kazakhstan, from Bosnia, influenced you as a mother in your own parenting?
Yes, I mean, I think in some ways, both those experiences and the work that I did at the toddler center before I started graduate school, I mean, yes and no, because I think I have this idea that I know how to deal with or spend time enjoying the development of the children who I had the most experience with, which was starting at 18 months and then going up to about 6 years of age. And most of the time that I spent with babies was actually more starting when I was 10 and my little brother was born, and I took care of him a lot because I was sort of big enough to do that. And so I think that I would say in some ways it makes me appreciate how wonderful the development of my child is going to be in the next few years. And at the same time, having a lot of experience with an 18-month-old doesn't necessarily give you any of the tools to take care of newborn. It's like a completely, so it's sort of, you have this idea that you're sort of this expert in children, and then somebody puts a baby in your arms and you realize, A, that it's completely different from a toddler who is talking a little bit and walking, and B, something that I sort of knew all along from babysitting and taking care of children, that taking care of a child for a few hours a day or observing a child for a few hours a day every day is completely different from having this sort of 24/7 obligation to them. So I think in some ways I appreciate the work that mothers, but also the caregivers at these children's homes did, because it's such a different commitment from just sort of popping in for a few hours and taking some notes and taking some videos and then going home. So.
You are totally new in India, but do you have have you made any observation about parenting in India so far?
No, I haven't been here long enough or seen enough little children on campus. But one thing that a friend of mine who does research here and has brought his children with him, just him to do his research sometimes, that he's told me is that it's a very family-friendly place. So people are, excited to see kids. In the U.S., sometimes, you go into a restaurant with your kid and you see that like they're going to place you in the back corner, or they'll say like there's no space for you because they know that your kid is going to make a mess or make too much noise. But what he has told me was that here it's sort of, there's more kind of excitement and acceptance for children and the unpredictability that they can bring. So I can only say that about what I know.
Thank you for your answer. Another of your field of interest as a cultural anthropologist, I would say, is cinema, and more specifically cinema within a framework of visual anthropology. And I have noticed that you have a strong interest in semiotics, and in this respect you seem particularly interested in the observation of symbolism within communist and post-communist movies. This is why you regularly take part as a jury in different film festivals, such as the International Festival of Ethnological Film, which is going to happen in Belgrade, in Serbia. But despite all their qualities, you know that movies from Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and so on are not very well known beyond Central and Eastern Europe. Although they have a lot of interesting things to say. I think, for example, of Gibanica Western, for example, the Yugoslav equivalent of the Soviet Westerns. So where did you get this interest for Eastern European cinema, and what did the study of communist, post-communist cinema bring to your research?
Thanks. So I first got interested in cinema when I was living in Sarajevo. So after I finished my undergrad education, I went and taught English in Sarajevo for a couple of years. And something I noticed was that when I was there, it was between 2004 and 2006, so the unemployment rate was still quite high, and there was this kind of general feeling of stagnation surrounding the international community sort of holding the place together, that it wasn't really kind of politically functioning. And so it wasn't, you could see, traces from the war, on buildings and things like that. So in that way, it was sort of still very much kind of hanging over. But the Sarajevo Film Festival, which happens every August and which started during the war, during the siege, that was this one moment in the year when the whole city seemed to come to life, and it seemed to have a really completely different atmosphere to it, where it seemed like Sarajevo all of a sudden became a cultural center in a way that it hadn't been since the war. I think everybody otherwise sort of looked back to the peak era of like 1984 when they hosted the Winter Olympics. And so when I left the region and I went and I did my project in Kazakhstan, and I decided after I finished that project I wanted to come back to the region because I missed going there. I wanted to do a project that wasn't focused on the sort of what I saw as being the kind of dominant narratives of war, disintegration, the kind of depressive atmosphere. And so I wanted to sort of hook onto something that maybe would give a more kind of hopeful story of the region. And so that's how I decided to start. And at the same time, from having spent time there, and I was married for a few years to a Bosnian who was very interested in film. And so it also seemed like a topic that was important to people, that people were interested in talking about cinema, that they had general knowledge about it. So it wasn't just something where it would be like a film studies project, but something where I could think about sort of how does film matter to people. And so then I started going back to the region and looking at different events, and I thought that I was going to be focusing more on international co-productions as a way that because of all this fracturing, each industry is quite small, so they depend a lot on co-productions within the region and then also abroad. But just to sort of learn about that whole landscape of the industry seemed like it was going to take time. And in the meantime, I found out about these socialist era film clubs where there was this idea that anybody should be able to make a film, that's sort of a right that every citizen should have. That was really strong under socialist Yugoslavia, and that in most places, including Sarajevo, seemed to sort of fall apart, but that there were places like Zagreb, Belgrade, and Split where those film scenes, the amateur film clubs had been really strong and had cultivated this experimental film scene, and that those did manage to kind of survive all of the transition and everything. And so I got to know some of them, and so I sort of shifted my focus to that, which I think ethnographically was more interesting to spend time doing, because I could see sort of everyday people getting interested in film in a way. Also that was more on my level and lent itself to me learning more about filmmaking, because it was something that had been a strong interest, but I didn't do a program in graduate studies that had that as a track. And so there's a way in which I could sort of learn as an amateur with them and do my field work, and also sort of cultivate my own interest in filmmaking. And so and it's been a really wonderful community to get involved in. So it's just been really a pleasure to be doing that field work, which is ongoing.
As you know, along with Dr. Puja, I'm running the film club of the Alliance School of Liberal Arts, and every Wednesday we try to provide our audience a cinematic experience by screening art films from all around the world. We have screened Russian movies, Soviet movies, Kazakh movie last week, Romanian movie we are going to see with you today. And so far we have not screened anything coming from ex-Yugoslavia. If you had to select one movie based on your own experience to introduce this kind of cinema to an Indian audience, what would you recommend?
That's a really difficult question because there are so many. I mean, I have to say, Emir Kusturica is the one filmmaker who people outside of the former Yugoslavia seem to know the most, and some of his later films especially have a kind of joyful craziness to them that on the one hand some people criticize as kind of perpetuating a kind of Orientalist fantasy of what the Balkans are. But other people, I think, really enjoy them. He's politically a very complicated character within Yugoslavia, so I don't want him to be my main recommendation. I would also say another, so I'll name two other filmmakers who are Slobodan Šijan, who made one film called Ko to tamo peva, which is also very joyful and funny, and yeah, he's a really wonderful, interesting character who sort of crosses over between more like black wave. I think he's a little bit later than the black wave, but some kind of more art house into kind of more popular. So his films are some of the more most loved films of the region. And then another person who was more controversial during Yugoslav times was Dusan Makavejev, who's also quite well known outside of it, but is maybe more art house because his craziness lends itself to maybe more controversy. But so those would be three good films to get started. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think there's a really strong repertoire of different films, both that have this kind of character of trying to capture a kind of crazy joyfulness that you can find in the region, and then others that are grappling with more serious subjects, such as the war and its aftermath. So,
well noted. I hope that we'll be able to screen one of these movies soon. You were mentioning the political background of Kusturica movies, and as you know, movies as any form of art, I would say, are not only cultural products, they are also cultural messages, given that through aesthetics they convey ideas, emotions, and so on. And all these elements shape our perception. You know the famous statement of Stalin on art that artists are the engineers of human soul. Regarding this, it goes without saying, I would say that during the last years in countries such as Kazakhstan, especially in Central Asia, but specifically in Kazakhstan, a country that we both know well, the local cinema industry has produced several blockbusters whose aim was to promote the national idea, I would say, through the glamorization of history, the glamorization of past. I think of movies like, Tamiris, for example, which was even commissioned by the Ministry of Culture, or A Diamond Sword, the so-called Kazakh Game of Thrones. What does this phenomenon tell us about the evolution of Central Asian society, and of Kazakhstani society in particular?
I mean, it's difficult because I think there's a huge gap in knowledge on my part of the history of Central Asian cinema, because I think that from having spoken to friends who have more knowledge of it, that there is this really interesting history. Maybe I'm not sure like where in the Soviet period that there was a peak, but that for example, documentary film was a space where there was a bit more freedom and quite a bit of experimentation with form, and so not having that background makes it more difficult for me to comment on what I've seen in Central Asia, and also what I've seen there is based on me not being there as a film scholar, but from what I can see, yeah, there are the sort of very official films that have these big messages that are perhaps getting a lot of government finance, but I think that the landscape is much more complicated than that, and then because you also have then the art house films that and this is to some extent a similar phenomenon from what I've been reading about Soviet era, where there might be films that don't have a large screening in Kazakhstan, or maybe didn't get a lot of funding, but then go abroad and get some awards, and then those directors maybe get more recognition once they come back, and so you can see that, and I think that you can see in the festival scene a few different directors, at least, who are kind of consistently popping up and making interesting films that are for more of an art house audience. But I think a question that remains for me, because when I was in Almaty, I didn't know where those were available to be screened, and so you would see in the newspaper that this film had won an award, but it wasn't necessarily being shown in the cinema. So there seemed to be these kind of two markets in terms of what's made for the national audience and what's made for festivals, and not necessarily a lot of room for Kazakhstani viewers to look at those. But it's hard for me to know if there's just a perception that there's no interest in that, or if they're seen as being problematic and they're not welcome, or sort of what is the cinematic landscape in Kazakhstan. I think it's a really interesting question that I would love to explore in the future.
I would say that I suppose that in India there is also this kind of double market with Bollywood blockbusters like Pathan, which is the latest success, I would say, of the Indian box office, and more confidential art films which are targeted for film festivals. So it is, I would say, a very similar situation in India. And do you have any interest in Indian cinema? Have you watched Indian movies before?
I have an interest in Indian cinema, but I think it's such a large, complicated landscape that I haven't started to. So I've watched a very few. My colleague Konstantin Nakasis works on Tamil cinema, and so I've seen a couple of films that he has written about. And which has been interesting because then I can sort of understand the film within sort of some kind of a context. And then in terms of kind of more classic Indian cinema, I've just seen one or two films by Sanjay Ray, and that's it. And so it's something that I'm curious about, and I will watch more.
Well, I hope that you will make benefit of this travel to India to learn more about Indian cinema.
Absolutely, yes.
As our audience may maybe know, you are teaching within the framework of a GLA program, Global Leaders Alliance Fellowship Program, and you are teaching a course on Eastern European cinema, and so you had the opportunity already to meet some of our Indian students. And how do you think about them? How do you think about the educational process in India? What kind of advice you might give to Indian students who would like to study cinema or Eastern European culture?
Oh, those are a lot of questions together, but no, the students have been great, and it's been really interesting to hear about their, to hear more about Indian cinema. And as you know, it's a course on Eastern European cinema culture, and so we've been focusing on so different cultural aspects of it. So yesterday, for example, we talked about cinema going as a sort of cultural practice. Rather than being an analysis of the films themselves. And so that was really interesting because I think, for example, in the US, we have this perception that cinema going is this kind of thing of the 20th century that happens very little unless we're doing some kind of 3D screening of a blockbuster film or whatever, or if you live in a city that has the art house cinemas, and then you go to the art house cinemas, and so it sort of defines who you are, whereas in the 20th century it was more of this thing that everybody does. And so it seems like, based on talking to them, that there's still sort of more of a culture of cinema going that is quite vibrant here in India, and so that's something that's quite interesting. And so I don't have advice for students who are interested in studying Eastern European film, but I think for me, but this is my take as an anthropologist, thinking about cinema and film requires thinking about the context in which it emerges, and so knowing about that and sort of studying those factors becomes a way of also having some insight into the film itself. And I think that the sort of specific conditions and constraints of filmmaking in Eastern Europe are also important for sort of understanding what could be made at different eras and why, whether it's questions of censorship or access to, I think it's been interesting for me just to learn about sort of the fact that Mosfilm, the studio in Moscow, had easier access to Kodak film to shoot on, and Lenfilm in Leningrad was stuck using the inferior quality locally made film, which meant that sometimes it disintegrated. And so sort of what are some of the material constraints that different artists are facing? What are the sort of expectations of audiences? I think the ways that all of those shape what gets made are super interesting to me, because it raises these questions of, does this film matter, and why does it matter, and to whom? So those are questions that I would encourage students to ask of films.
Nice. I hope that you will cultivate their curiosity for this area of the world. Dr. Meghanne, you were mentioning the importance of going to a cinema, of developing this kind of practice as a ritual to watch movies in in a cinema. And because of the digitalization, I would say, of the cultural industry in general, and also because of a pandemic, because of COVID, the cultural practice have changed a lot, especially for young people who maybe never, even for some of them, maybe never had an opportunity to go to the cinema before. Do you remember your first cinematic experience? What was the first movie that you have seen in the cinema?
I can only vaguely remember the first film that I've seen, but I'll talk about the first memorable cinema-going experience that I had, which was when I was 8 years old, and I had just finished 3rd grade, and my mother was my teacher that year. And it was our last day of school, but I was staying overnight with a friend who lived in town, and I grew up on a farm. This is all important because we went to see Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it was the first time that we were allowed to sit apart from our friend's mom. So it was the 2 of us, and we were going to sit somewhere else in the theater, but it's a very small theater in a very small town, so she could still see us. But we had this feeling of independence, and so we were very excited. So we thought, first of all, to go to the very back of the theater, because that would be the coolest place. But the very back row was taken by a couple of teenagers. And so we sat right in front of them. And so they had, for their own reasons, this couple of teenagers didn't want 2 8-year-old girls sitting in front of them. And so the boys started throwing Skittles, little candies, at the back of our heads. And so then we got up and moved to somewhere kind of in the middle. And there was a big group of teenagers, and they all started making fun of us for wearing accidentally matching outfits. But we sat there because we didn't want to go back and bother the other teenagers anymore. And so that was my first memorable cinema going experience of sitting apart. And the basic takeaway was that teenagers were terrifying. And at the same time, I also was watching the movie feeling sad about the fact that my mom wasn't going to be my teacher anymore, even though I didn't want her to know that I liked having her as a teacher. And so it was a sort of complicated emotional process for me.
Well, despite I would say the painful side of this memory, it helped you to grow your curiosity for cinema and develop your culture in cinema.
Absolutely, yeah. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, really important film.
Dr. Meghanne, thank you very much for this conversation.
Yeah,
thank you for your time.
It's been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.